Welcome back to NewsX World. I'm Joshua Barnes and you're watching Focal Length, where we give you a briefing on topics from across the world. There is an ongoing crisis in the Middle East currently which has impacted nations across the world. So what is China's stance on the conflict? What sort of involvement does the United States of America have? How did the intervention of different world countries influence this conflict? Who benefits from this war, and can there ever be a ceasefire? Let's find out. Joining us is Jonathan Fulton. He is a non-resident senior fellow for the Atlantic Council's Middle East programme and the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative. He is an expert on Chinese policy toward the Middle East. Additionally, Mr. Fulton is an associate professor of political science at the Zayed University in Abu Dhabi. Thank you, Jonathan Fulton, for joining us. My first question to you is, how do you view China's current role when it comes to the Middle Eastern crisis, especially in the war between Israel and Palestine?
China's role in this is pretty limited. What China's been doing is reaching out to the Arab street. It's been trying to garner support for a lot of its global initiatives, the global security, global civilizational, global development initiatives. This is positioning China as a leader of the global south. So they're looking for Arab support in a lot of these initiatives. So I think a lot of what they're doing in the rhetorical support for Palestine is to use this crisis as a way to support their position in doing this. I do also think it's not purely cynical. That China's got a long-standing two-state policy to the Israel-Palestine crisis. So that is the preferred outcome for China. But in terms of what they've been doing, I think it's really been quite limited because they don't have the diplomatic capacity to really play a leadership position in this.
How do you categorise and view America's involvement in the war in Gaza?
The U.S. support for Israel is existential for Israel. So there's really no way that this happens without America offering the support. I think that's become more troublesome for the Biden administration. I think at the beginning of the crisis in early October, you saw this unquestioned support for Israel. As the war has dragged on, I think it's become a lot more difficult for people to justify in the States. And I think that's becoming a problem. I think Joe Biden has made it pretty clear he wants to see a ceasefire. I think he's not going to walk away from Israel ever. But I think he's probably going to try to use whatever leverage he has with the Israeli government to try to put an end to it.
Do you think there will ever be a model of sustainable peace in Gaza?
I'm skeptical. That's just because I'm the age I am. I'm 48. My entire life this has been an issue. I don't see it not being an issue anytime soon. When I talk to Israelis, even the so-called liberal Israelis, who would like to see this problem resolved, I think there's a very deep fear that providing a state in Gaza is going to mean that Israel's got a permanent enemy on its border. So it's going to be pretty hard to resolve. I don't see how it works. I think there's a lot of actors outside of Israel and Palestine that are involved as well, which makes it even more complicated. A lot of Arab countries, a lot of Arab leaders, non-state actors. It's tremendously complex and sad.
The US and its allies have been continuously appealing for a ceasefire in Gaza, but to a lot of people this is seen as lip service, a mere formality, they say. How do you view their appeal for a ceasefire and humanitarian aid in Gaza?
I would reject the idea that it's lip service. I think you could see from Senator Schumer's speech last week about no longer wanting to support Prime Minister Netanyahu, that the tide of public opinion in the U.S. in particular is a lot more complicated than I think a lot of people recognize. There's elections coming up in the U.S., there's elections coming up in the U.K. and Canada and a lot of Western liberal democracies. These are countries that have very large Arab, Muslim, and Jewish populations. So this becomes an issue that people vote on. This is something that people fundamentally care about. And I think the idea that it's lip services is really just not acknowledging the domestic pressure within these countries to see some kind of a solution.
President Joe Biden a few weeks ago issued a very stern warning to Iran. Do you think the Americans are capable of dealing with Iran, and do they understand how complex Iran's role in the crisis really is?
A day or two later, you saw the U.S. Attacking and hitting Iranian militias. So I think they've got the carrots and the sticks. I don't know how Iran's going to respond to this, but I think the Biden administration has been very wary of adopting too hawkish an approach to Iran. We've seen a big change in the U.S. approach to Iran from the Trump administration to the Biden, and I expect that will continue. With the election coming up, I think this is something they don't want to see a broader escalation.
Do you think the United States and especially Israel can survive these strained relations with their neighbours in the Middle East?
Well, I think this is nothing new, right? There's been strained relations between Israel and its neighbors in the Middle East for 70 plus years. I think what's different is we had this sense from the Abraham Accords on that was changing. And I don't think that fundamentally I think that remains the case. I think there's still an appetite for a lot of other countries to start this process of normalization. I think just right now it's very, very politically difficult for Arab countries to do so. But I think the animating factor in what brought these countries to normalize relations with Israel remains. Countries that want to see foreign investment come into the region, countries that want to see new industries, new jobs for young people, and geopolitics playing less a role in people's day-to-day lives. And I think the same can be said of Israelis. So I think ultimately when this crisis starts to ebb, we might see a return to dialogue that might lead to something more hopeful.
Turkey has been a NATO member. It has supported Iran. How should America deal with Turkey?
They should deal with Turkey very, very carefully. It's difficult. It's a difficult relationship to manage, not just for the U.S. but for NATO. We've seen this when Turkey used the Swedish and Finland application to NATO as a political tool for themselves. Turkey has been very, very transactional with a lot of its allies in NATO in recent years. They've been pursuing a different agenda than the U.S. in the Middle East, and this has made it very, very difficult for America, I think. Ultimately, Turkey could be a very, very useful partner, I think, not just for the U.S., but for a lot of U.S. allies and partners. Whether or not they can get Turkey on board is another matter. And I think Turkey is dealing with different issues, whether it's, Syria or Kurdish populations or Iraq, any number of issues where it's very difficult for Turkey to see the region in the same way that the U.S. and its allies and partners see it.
Russia is, of course, engaged in the war with Ukraine. China's standing has fallen for more reasons than one following COVID-19. Do you think they've benefited from the Middle East conflict as attention has been deflected away from them?
I think they're looking at this on two levels, both countries. I think for China, which I focus more on in my work, I think on one level, China sees it as an opportunity. As I've mentioned earlier, China's got these alternative norms for global governance and the global security development and civilization initiatives. These are meant to appeal to the global South. And I think in this, China's trying to position itself as a leader to say, look, we have a different way of doing international politics than the West, and they're trying to engage with these countries. Gaza has presented them with an opportunity to show how it looks in at least rhetorical and diplomatic practice. So on the one hand, it's been useful. On the other hand, it's been a disaster because the Middle East is primarily a place for China to do business. It does a lot of contracting, it buys a lot of energy, and it also does a lot of trade. And that requires stability, and that's made the current crisis has made China's position in the region much more complex. For Russia, I think also it's a two-level issue. I think on the one hand, anything that gives Russia the chance to position itself as an alternative to the U.S. is useful for Moscow, and they've done this. At the same time, I think Russia's worried about animating its Muslim population in the Caucasus region. So when they look at this crisis in Gaza, I think they're not really looking at the crisis in Gaza. I think they're looking at how is this going to affect us domestically at a time when we're fighting a war, when there's already a lot of folks inside the country that are quite upset with the government's policies.
Do you think the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Commission has suffered a setback as a result of the war in Gaza and across the Middle East?
I wouldn't characterize it as a setback. I'd say a pause. I was in Washington recently, and folks there said that there's still a lot of appetite for Middle Eastern actors to work on this. They're kind of laying the groundwork at this point. The idea being that this fits into a larger set of objectives for countries like the UAE, Saudi, and Israel, that they want to create new industries, more connectivity, supply chains, business clusters. And you don't do this by hiving yourself off from your neighbors. You do this by building more connectivity. So I think right now it's difficult to operationalize this IMEC, but I do think that behind the scenes there's movement. I think when the situation in Gaza starts to improve, we'll probably see a lot more momentum in this IMEC project.
Thank you, Jonathan Fulton, for speaking to us on Focal Length. With that, it's a wrap on this episode. For more international news updates, stay tuned on NewsX World.